Recording. Okay, do you see a recording now?
It's been recorded. Yes.
It is. Sorry, thank you. Hi, Marjorie. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for coming this evening to our workshop on the state of inclusive education in New Jersey. My name is Stephanie Babbitt, and I am the project director for the START team. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Okay. Great. Okay. So tonight we are talking about the state of inclusive education in New Jersey, SEPAGs as champions for an inclusive school culture and climate. First, I'd like to introduce our team. As I mentioned, I am Stephanie Babbitt. I am the project director for START Engaging Parents and Students with Disabilities. I'm joined this evening by my colleagues, Beth Cosentino, who is our project coordinator. Brenda Figueroa is not here this evening, and I just wanted to mention real quick, she is unable to attend and usually does the Spanish interpretation. We will not have Spanish interpretation this evening. However, we are doing the recording of this workshop this evening, and she will be translating it, and it will be made available at a future time. So thank you for your understanding this evening. Also joined this evening by Ellie Santiago, a parent group specialist in our team, and Ellen Woodcock and Mackenzie D. Maria. Closed captioning is available, so please locate the live transcript button on the control bar and click on Show Subtitle to activate closed captioning. And now Ellen is going to talk a little bit about SPAN. Ellen?
Thank you, Stephanie. Good evening, everyone. We just wanted to talk a little bit about SPAN and give an overview. SPAN's projects and programs for parents of children from birth to age 26 and for women of childbearing age, they extend to over 40 national, regional, and local programs, which are funded by government agencies, foundations, and fee-for-service contracts. And these programs, they cover education, health, mental health, human services, childcare, and welfare. And our mission foremost is to empower and support families and inform and involve professionals interested in the healthy development and education of children and youth. So our foremost commitment is to children and families with the greatest needs. So this workshop is presented tonight, as Stephanie said, by the Start Engaging Parents of Students with Disabilities team project in partnership with the New Jersey Department of Education, the Office of Special Education, and SPAN Parent Advocacy Network. So again, we offer programs and services that support the engagement of families to improve outcome for students, including developing and sustaining special education parent advisory and support groups in communities and school districts. Assistance is available for schools and districts for parents and parent leaders to enhance family engagement to improve outcomes for students with disabilities. So I'm going to pass it back over to Stephanie for a moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellen. So our goals for this evening, we are going to Dr. Lalvani will provide an overview of inclusive education. We will review the barriers and findings from a recent study. And then lastly, we'll tie this all together to talk about how to leverage your CPAG as a champion for change. We are so excited tonight to have Dr. Priya Lalvani here as our guest presenter. Dr. Priya is a professor at Montclair State University. She teaches courses in disability studies and is the coordinator for the graduate programs in inclusive education. She holds a PhD in developmental psychology. Her research is focused on examining the way that society and politics affect the experiences of individuals with disabilities and their families. Through her research, Priya seeks to confront ableism in schools and society and to highlight the problems with dividing students based on their abilities and the resulting segregation of many students with disabilities in schools. She is the co-author of Undoing Ableism, Teaching About Disability in K-12 Classrooms, and the editor of Constructing the Mother, Narratives of Disability, Motherhood, and the Politics of Normal. Priya is also the parent of a daughter with a disability who was fully included in her neighborhood school since she was 2.5 years old. We are so pleased to have you back. Priya did a wonderful workshop for us a few years ago, so we're so happy to have you back tonight. So the floor is all yours. And for anyone who comes to our workshops, we have the chat box. Feel free to, I'm sure you're going to hear a lot of comments and ask questions. We will have opportunities for questions later on, but definitely feel free to use the chat box. So Priya, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that warm welcome and that lovely introduction. I should add that I have 2 children, lest my son feel I left him out. So I'm the mother of 2 kids, one that is, I'd like to say, culturally constructed as non-disabled or normal, and one daughter who is now a young woman of 22, who did, as you say, go through the entire system, fully included since she was 2.5 years old. So I'll jump right into my presentation. And I'll start with sort of an overview of what inclusive education is, because I know everyone here is obviously invested or interested in inclusive education, but I should start by saying there isn't a formal definition of inclusive education. It depends on who you ask, but since you're asking me, I'm gonna go with what is generally used as a rights-based, justice-based definition adopted by entities such as UNESCO globally. So inclusive education is generally considered to be education within neighborhood schools, in general education classrooms, using strategies that are responsive to each student's strengths and needs for support. And that could mean, and does in this context mean, students with disabilities, but we really should bear in mind that real inclusive education pertains to all kids, regardless of what their identity is or what their background is or what their story is, and what their needs are. So in the context of disability is what we're going to be talking about, but we should always bear in mind that inclusive education hasn't always been about disability. It's been historically in our country about social class. The right to education for all actually began there. And it's been about race and segregation. And today we're talking about disability. So it's really important to me to sort of frame it in that bigger context of where we've been, as a story of inclusivity. So really, when we're talking about students with disabilities, specifically inclusive education involves the provision of accommodations, modifications, behavioral support, communication support, any kind of support that a student would need in a general education environment. It goes beyond all of that. It really requires that teachers, educators set up in advance accessible learning environments. They make adaptations not only to the content, to the curriculum, to the physical space, to everything. So we really need to start by doing sort of that mental adjustment, if you will. And often people use the term inclusion. We sometimes hear in schools the term inclusion, quote unquote, use the inclusion classroom.
Priya, you're muted.
Oh,
There
I
you
got
go.
muted. Okay. So I was saying that sometimes we hear it used incorrectly, like I teach the inclusion room, which generally means nothing because inclusion isn't a room or a space. It's the provision of supports in a general education space. And we also need to remember that just putting a kid in a general education classroom does not make it inclusive education, right? So we're going to talk a lot more about that. Next slide, Stephanie. So let's look at inclusive education in the context of our federal law, Individuals with Disabilities Act, now called Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. And it's interesting to note that the term inclusive education does not actually appear in the laws itself. What does appear is the idea that, no pun intended, that students with disabilities should be educated to the maximum extent appropriate, actually it's appropriate, alongside their non-disabled peers. And this second bullet directly from IDEA, removal, they mean removal of a student with a disability from a general education environment. Removal may only occur when education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So to me, that bullet, it's one sentence, but it says a lot. And think about it. It's saying removal may only occur, which means it's assuming that a child is first in a general education classroom. The clause is only for removal. So also bear that in mind. The law stipulates that the first consideration is and always should be the general education classroom. So the question that often arises, and it should, is, so are there any benefits of this? Like, oh, it sounds great, but is it really good for my kid? So to that, I think you should know that, I mean, there's a wide breadth of research. Some of it is here at the end of this presentation for those who are interested. But to summarize it all into a slide for you, there is a wide breadth of research that shows that generally students with disabilities educated in general education settings overall have better academic and social gains, or they do better overall. So breaking it down, there's research on the social and interpersonal gains for students with disabilities, improved language and stronger communication skills. And we're talking comparing students with similar needs for support in general education classrooms with students with similar disabilities or similar needs for support in a self-contained classrooms. That's what these studies have been based on. So they also demonstrate higher reading and math assessment scores for those educated in gen ed classrooms, expressive language literacy, including for students with intellectual disability labels, autism, and the full breadth of disability. And also, I should say that the benefits are demonstrated in research well beyond the school years, because there is research that connects inclusive education to outcomes post K-12, right? So you see higher rates of employment within the community, community-based employment versus workshop type settings. You also see higher rates of enrollment in post-secondary education among the group of students who were in general education. Oh, I should say that's bolded over there. And there's always the concern about the impact on students without disabilities. That's always thrown as a, well, you know, it's gonna have a negative impact on them. But interestingly, there has not been to date any significant negative impact beyond the immediate. When you look at the broader picture on math and reading scores, no academic negative impact. Interestingly, it's not on this slide, but there is a whole bunch of research on the benefits for non-disabled students. So there is not a lot of research to be found on the negative impact for non-disabled students, but there is a whole host of research on the benefits for non-disabled students who are educated in classrooms that are set up to be truly inclusive. So let's look. So we've looked at what inclusive ed is supposed to be, what it supposed to look like, what the law says, and now let's look at what things look like in our country and in New Jersey. So in New Jersey, about 45% of all K-12 students are educated inclusively, and this word inclusively is generally understood in the field as an 80% or more in the general education classroom, 80% or more of the day in the general education classroom. And so to me, that's interesting as well. To be considered fully inclusive, It just needs to be 80%. And based on that kind of odd way of defining full inclusion, based on that, only 45% of our students are educated in general education classrooms. That's the New Jersey statistic, whereas the national statistic is 65%. So there's a big difference there, right? In New Jersey, less than half of our children are in what's considered fully inclusive settings. New Jersey, actually, for the last couple of decades, has consistently ranked as the state in the union with the highest rates of segregation in schools by race as well as by disability. I thought it would be interesting to point out. Now, that number that you saw, the 45% of all kids, that's when you look at all disabilities and including those students with IEPs that have minimal needs for support. When you disaggregate that by disability type or label or category classification, the numbers look very different. So here's one example. When you look at the intellectual disability label, 6.8% of children with intellectual disabilities are educated inclusively. Nationally, it's also pretty bad. That's 17.9. But in New Jersey, a mere 6.8% of any child classified under intellectual disability is likely to make their way into a general ed class. And I can bet that this webinar room is populated by many parents who may have actually advocated for their children, maybe with labels of intellectual disabilities. So it's interesting that that number incorporates those kids whose parents actually advocated for them. So then one has to ask, without that, what would that number have looked like? New Jersey, by the way, ranks out of 50 states, it ranks number 50, with 50 being last on its record on delivery of education in the least restrictive environment. So that's per the latest data of the United States Department of Education. So the question is why? I'm going to give you some thoughts now and some findings, but I'm not gonna, I don't want, this is not the definitive why. Like, I'm not here to say this is why it's happening, but let's look at some things that we should think about that may be contributing to this issue. For one, let's look at flaws in implementation of inclusive education. So earlier I had said just putting a child in a general education class does not make it inclusive education, right? I speak to a lot of parents about inclusive education all the time. They speak to teachers all the time. That's my job. So one thing that people say a lot to me, you know, we tried inclusive education, but it didn't work. And then I ask, well, what did you try? Right? You tried inclusive education. Yeah, we put the child, we tried him out for science. We had him join for science, but you know, he just really wasn't able to keep up there, or you know. So this idea that placing a child, so if we don't implement inclusive education well with the full breadth of supplementary aids and services that can be considered, it's going to lead to the false conclusion that it doesn't work. But we need to separate whether inclusive education doesn't work or whether inclusive education was or was not even actually implemented in the first place. So we should remember that as per IDEA, a full breadth of what's called supplementary aids and services can be provided to students with disabilities in a general education classroom. Well, what does that mean, right? Supplementary aids and services can include many things. For example, it can include any kind of mobility, services or devices. It includes accommodations that the child needs for learning. It can include a modified curriculum. It can include the provision of a one-to-one support person. It can include a push-in support from a special education teacher. It can include devices for communication, apps, AAC, augmentative communication devices, behavioral support, and so on. I could go on all night. But the idea is, first, we need to exhaust all possible supports that that child could use and can benefit from in the general education classroom before considering removal. Remember the line that I so loved, removal can only occur when we've tried all the supplementary aids and services. So the other thing that we don't think about as much, inclusive education and special education in general, the whole system is aimed at interventions. The interventions are aimed at the student with the disability, right? And I'm not saying that's bad, because interventions and supports for students with disabilities is, right, the IEP. But is it the whole package? When inclusive education is solely targeted at the student with the disability, I argue it is still not going to be enough. We also need, in addition, to create a culture in the classroom, to create an environment, and that means educating non-disabled students. So I argue that the full range of supplementary aids and services also includes considering whether that will be a welcoming and a good place where that student can communicate. Let's say it's a non-speaking student. How is that non-speaking student going to feel a sense of belonging? What ways will that classroom be structured so that we can educate others around for how to communicate with the student, and so on? So the interventions need to be both ways. It's not always the student with the disability that must be fixed and must conform to the norms of the rest of the classroom. So the second big area of the problem, if we'll want to call that, is that many educators continue to hold beliefs that inclusive education is beneficial only for certain students with disabilities. And there's a ton of research on that. I'll talk about my own study that I did a while ago. And it's been a decade since then, but let's remember that I'm also a teacher educator, and I speak to students who are in classrooms every single day. And there continues to be this perception that inclusive education is great, but it's great for some kinds of kids with disabilities. And in the 2013 study I did, the teachers that I spoke to said they were, they described themselves as very much in support of inclusive education. However, they believed that access to the general education classroom was based on certain criteria, like type of disability. Like they said things like, inclusive education is great, but not for autism. And like not for Down syndrome. Surely you don't mean that. So it's interesting to me that wonderful, wonderful educators may be under this misconception that you need to have certain entry-level criteria to be placed in a general education classroom. And some teachers actually believed that it was based on a child's IQ, based on the evaluations, based on quote unquote functioning level, or that the child needed to have no disruptive or maladaptive behaviors in order to be considered candidates. Right? This word candidates comes up a lot. Like, he's not a good candidate. It's not a job interview. Remember, the law just said, the first consideration, the default placement is the general. Everyone's a candidate. We are there. We begin there, right? And being verbal that came as a shocker to me. this idea that many teachers that I worked with believed that a child needed to speak or be verbal in their communicating in order to be placed in a general education classroom. By the way, it should go without saying, but I'll say it, but none of these are actually criteria for placement in a general education class. Absolutely not. You can, I mean, like I said, the law says for all students with disabilities, that is the first default placement consideration. Third big area is problematic placement practices. So I've been doing research on this for about 2 decades. I've done numerous studies on teachers' perceptions, parent belief and expectations, parents' experiences at IEPs, and I've attended like a couple of hundred IEPs probably. Now, here's what's interesting that comes out generally across the research, and there's a bunch of other studies that also find similar stuff. That parents who seek inclusive education, I'm specifically talking about that group of parents. When parents seek inclusive education, particularly those whose children are labeled under certain categories, intellectual disability, as I said, autism, multiple disabilities, and emotional disturbance. Those 4 categories find themselves encountering a great deal of institutional obstacles. In this group, across all groups, but particularly in these 4 categories, parents say that they were informed that self-contained environments are quote unquote best, or the best option or the only option for them. The justifications that were provided for the removal of their children from the general education classroom did not seem to be consistent with IDEA. And across the literature, a huge body of literature out there on this topic, one thing stands out. Decisions pertaining to inclusive education, even to this day, they seem to be parent-driven, especially when we're talking about these 4 special education classifications that I mentioned. And the other thing then we see, which follows from the fact that they are parent-driven, is that placement patterns are also based on socioeconomic status and ethnicity. So that's a complicated sort of relationship there, because inclusive education is driven by parent advocacy. Anything that's driven by advocacy is likely to be subject to inequities, right? Because not everyone has the capacity to engage in advocacy. It's an unfair expectation for some parents. Not everybody has the resources available to them, both financial resources or just cultural resources or time or language. The language to fight, quote unquote, the system, or in their words. So it gives us pause, because if inclusive education requires parent advocacy, then we should be concerned also, because it's going to lead to discrepancies based on the varying levels of privilege that we all hold as parents or caregivers. So let's just quickly touch upon the A word, ableism, if that hasn't already, like what's at the root of all of this, right? Ableism, which is generally understood as discriminatory or negative or a devaluing of people with disabilities or the disabled experience. So when we think about ableism in the context of schooling, of course, ableism exists in the context of societies in general, like how we think about disability in our society as generally a negative thing, right? But in the context of schooling, let's just think about it. First of all, our schools are set up to the advantage of non-disabled students. Right there, it's stacked. Everything, the spaces, the ways in which we are expected to communicate, to sit, to learn in certain ways. I mean, how did we come up with these? We came up with these. They work for the majority, but they don't work for everybody. They tend to work largely for non-disabled, middle class, white, um, heteronormative students, right? So when we look at it in the context of disability, what happens is that when students with IEPs are unable to comply with these expectations that have been set up, the response generally is removal of that child. Instead of thinking, wait a minute, perhaps we didn't set this up fairly, right? We think this is how we're supposed to act in here. You're not able to do it. I think you should be in a self-contained classroom, right? Sometimes, a lot of times, I would argue, acting out may actually be a result of lack of access. A child may not have been given access to communication. There might be other barriers. There might be expectations that are unfair of not moving, keeping your hands still, not flapping, don't do this, sit in a certain way, your hand in a certain way. We use our words to talk. I mean, we don't always have to use our words to talk. There are many other ways of communicating, by the way. Like, who said that verbal communication is the only way that we communicate? Yet, when a student who doesn't have access, quote unquote, acts out, the response, again, is a consequence to the student instead of the person who failed to give access to that student. Next slide, Stephanie. So now I'm going to sort of zero in on a recent study that I conducted. And I said I've been doing this research for 20 years. I was interested a couple of years ago in how much things have changed, right? Because people say, oh, yeah, well, your last study is, some years ago. And, yeah, we're doing it now. We're good. So I said, let me see how much things have really changed in the last decade. And I embarked on a new study with my colleague, Dr. Eileen Osija, who I think might be joining us, has joined us here today. So a shout out to Dr. Osija, my co-pilot on this study. And I will walk you through the findings of that study. So the general findings in a nutshell, and there's a lot there, are as follows. Oh, so I should actually say a little bit before I talk about the findings. So the parents that we recruited, parents and caregivers of children who were classified under intellectual disability, or they had a developmental disability, or they had a disability that was associated with high needs for support or extensive support needs. So we specifically recruited family members or caregivers that had children who, in the context of schools, required a high level of support. And we recruited parents and caregivers who had specifically, at least at one time or on one occasion, hoped for or wanted or asked for inclusive education. So we wanted to rule out the argument that some parents themselves request self-contained classrooms. And I agree, and I'm aware of that. We wanted to really just understand the experiences of those who actually are asking for inclusive education, are actually asking for their children's right. So there were 34 parents in the study. They hailed from a wide range of backgrounds, ethnicities, and yeah. So we spoke to them The interviews lasted from 1 to 3 hours. These were not your small sort of check off the box survey, kind of like, are you happy? Are you not happy? Kind of like, I don't do that kind of research. We really sat with them and we got their story from the beginning to end. In a nutshell, and of course there's a lot of nuance and a lot of details to the findings, but here's the thing. Every single parent in the study reported immense institutional roadblocks. Every single parent in the study reported that at least on one occasion, okay, and for some on more than one occasion spanning 10 years, for some spanning 12 years, they was reported that they were steered by the child study team professionals towards considering more restrictive settings for their children. Every single parent in the study said that they were informed by some professional at their school that a self-contained classroom was best or better or the only option that was available in the district for their child, in blatant violation of what we just reviewed is stated in IDEA. These parents said that they needed to advocate for inclusive education, and most of them believed that without their advocate, well, to be fair, some of these parents' children had, through their advocacy, ended up being in a general education classroom. Other parents at the time of the study were still advocating and had been advocating for years, and their children were still, it was, not determined what was going to happen. And all right, so I'm going to read out some actual quotes from the study, and I think it might be interesting if those of you who are here that are parents, if it sounds familiar to you, or if you've heard or been told anything to that general effect, you can pop it in the chat, or you can use your emoji feature. So let us know if anything like that was ever sent your way. So the parents said things like, just the one option was provided in response to when they asked, can inclusive education be considered for my child? This parent says just that option was provided. No, there was no discussion about alternatives at all. They said, this is the model we have. We don't have that model. They said the ABA classroom was the best because here he will be able to learn and get the attention he needs. Another parent said they felt that he needed a smaller, more intimate setting in order to focus. I just love that one. I love the whole intimate setting. It kind of evokes candlelight, roses in self-contained classroom. Yep. Next slide. How about these? So generally the reasoning that, or we call it the justifications that were provided, because as per IDEA, any removal of a child from a general education setting requires a justification by the district. I should also say that in stark contrast to the way that IDEA says removal will only occur, assuming that the child is there. The majority, if not, I don't want to say majority, but a large number of these parents said that their children began their educational lives, began in a highly self-contained, highly segregated setting. Right? So they had never entered a general education class. No supplementary aids and services had been attempted. There had been no discussion about them seriously. The child was 3. They began their educational careers in a segregated setting based on some of these highly questionable justifications. So the justifications, we've divided them. Dr. Asija and I sort of divided them into different categories of justifications. The first Stephanie, can you go back to the previous slide? So these justifications are a cluster that sort of focus on we don't have it. We call it the we don't have it, or the this is best category, right? So no, because these intimate places, these lovely, romantic, intimate, self-contained places, those are just best. That's it. You can't have general education placement because self-contained is just better or best, or it's the only one we have. So this is one category. So the next category is different. Some people got this. This category we call based on the child's characteristic. Whereas the previous category was we don't have it or this space is best. Here, it's actually about the kid, the child, the student cannot be in general education because the student is not meeting the criteria. So how about some of these, if you've ever been told, heard, or believe? They said he couldn't articulate or speak. And so they recommended the language learning disabled self-contained placement for pre-K. He couldn't articulate or speak. And you want to ask, did you provide him with the access tools that he would need in order to be able to communicate? The child is nonverbal. This doesn't mean he cannot communicate using an augmentative communication device. Perhaps that had to be the conversation. In fact, it did have to be the conversation as per law, but it did not happen. Another was told because he's nonverbal and his IQ is a lot lower than the other children, he needs a lot of supports. Another was told, oh, I love this one. They said, we don't want her to feel different. We must protect her dignity. And so to protect her dignity, we will put her in a segregated space because we don't want her to feel different. And they explained that she belonged in a self-contained classroom. She would be with children just like her. If it's not clear already, again, I'll say it, none of these are permissible as per IDEA. These are in clear and blatant violation of what could have been provided as these reasons were provided to parents that the child could not be in a general education classroom because the child was not speaking, was not reading, didn't have the right IQ, and quite simply didn't belong. Again, the question that should have been raised, that could have been raised is, well, if my child doesn't feel like they belong, what are you planning to do to help my child to belong? That's the conversation that needs to be happening at an IEP. If you feeling that my child is not going to fit in, or which was used also, fit in, keep up, the child won't be able to keep up. Your child won't be able to fit in. Your child won't have any friends. Well, then the question behooves, then let's talk about what supports you can put in place so that my child can feel like they belong. Next slide, Stephanie. So let's look at these really in light of IDEA and what really is problematic about them. So this first idea that we want to understand is this idea of burden of proof, right? So the law places the burden of proof on districts, not on parents. Instead, we had a lot of parents that we spoke to that were telling us that they made like I'm using their language. We made a case for inclusive education. And you see parents do that a lot. They do the research. They find out. They write all these documents explaining why they believe inclusive education would be right for their child. They provide documentation. We had a mother who said she took videos of her child at home interacting with siblings and with peers to demonstrate or to make a point at the IP meeting that her child would benefit from being with other children. It breaks my heart, actually, that this mother had to do that. This mother needn't have done that. There is no reasoning, there's no reason that needs to be provided for placement in a general education classroom. Again, that is the default placement. Yet these parents were running circles, looking up research, writing essays, documenting things, and none of that needed to have been done. The law says that the burden of the proof is on the district. Only removal requires a justification. Placement in a general education classroom requires no reason or justification. That is where they are assumed to be. The other thing we want to understand, in light of these quotes that we just saw, right? Evaluations and assessments, they can do that, but they are not meant to guide decisions about placement. It really doesn't matter. The outcomes of the assessments are for the purpose of deciding the supports that your child is to get. So we had a lot of parents that said, they said that they did the evaluations, and based on the evaluations, inclusive education is not for your child because they did really poorly on this or that or the other. Well, the evaluations, the assessments are to guide us to say, okay, well, this is what this has shown us. So therefore, this is the battery of services that we'll need to provide to this child. An evaluation cannot be used to determine denial of access to a general education setting. A full breadth of supplementary aids and services needs to be considered and documented. So at an IEP, what should have happened was that a list of all possible supports and services that can be attempted should have been drawn up, but that was not done. And also we should remember that no child, no student needs to demonstrate quote unquote readiness. A child does not need to be ready. A child is ready by virtue of being born. They're there. They exist. So it is their natural right to be in their natural community of peers, just like anyone else, right? So it almost seems to me an ethical or moral problem. That burden is being put on a child. Inadvertent, like, right, implicitly. To say that if you can walk this way, talk this way, read this way, write this way, then you can be among us. And that to me is really disturbing. Okay. All right, next slide. And this, I coined the steering practices of special education, right? We hear of steering practices commonly used in the context of other things like the real estate world. I borrow from that to call it the steering practices of special education. And in this study, it came out, and in my 20 years of research, this has come out quite consistently. This phenomenon of professionals selling self-contained spaces to parents, right? So in this study, also parents said that professionals emphasized the bells and whistles of self-contained classrooms. They were steered towards them. They were told in the general education classroom, and again, if parents are over here and if you've heard anything like this, it's going to be too loud. It's going to be too wild. It's going to be too fast. There's too many kids there. It's going to be too much. Your child will be overwhelmed. They're not going to be able to keep up. Here in our lovely, intimate, smaller, self-contained classroom, we have lots of services. It's small. Your child will get one-on-one help. It's almost like you're trying to package and market. And that is exactly what was happening, the packaging of segregation as desirable. And some parents, oh, there's a quote at the end, actually, that one, the last bullet point is a quote from the study. This dad said, they convinced me somehow, they said it's better to be in a small class for his confidence, for his learning. And I think I started believing that. And that just sort of captures the psychology of it all. I mean, I'm a parent, right? I get how this works. You tell me, I'm a parent, if I don't know otherwise, I trust you. I trust you. You're a professional. You're the expert. I'm the mom. You're telling me that my kid will be lost here. They won't keep up. They won't learn anything. They won't make friends. Here in this other place, they're going to get attention. They're going to learn their services here. Why would I not want my kid there? Right? What they failed to tell the parent actually is that all the things that they were saying that were available in the self-contained classroom can actually be provided in a general education classroom. There is nothing that is being done there that cannot be implemented in a general education classroom. So that piece was missing. They were misinformed. And many parents in the study said that initially they came to view self-contained education as desirable and in their children's best interest. And some people used words like convinced. They convinced me. Also really, really disturbing that, I mean, we are, if we're professionals, and I've sat on both ends of the table, so I use the we both ways as parent. I mean, it's the responsibility of the child study team professionals to inform parents who are relying on them to give them the correct information. Next slide, please, Stephanie. And then this really came to light, this idea that parents were told that their child might not be able to fit in or feel safe or make friends in a general education classroom. And professionals in this study recommended segregating children in order to give them a sense of belonging, right? I mean, one mother was literally told, there was the quote earlier, we want to protect her dignity, we want her to belong, we feel she will belong with others just like her, I quote. So first of all, it's a little bit funny to me that you'd want to segregate a child in order to help them to belong. It's kind of an oxymoron there. But beyond being ironic and funny, it's quite blatantly discriminatory practice. I mean, you don't remove the very child that is experiencing a sense of belonging. You are giving the consequence to the child instead of to the community that is rejecting the child, right? Instead of asking, why does the child not belong here? What do I need to change here? What needs to change here? You're saying the kid needs to leave. And I'm going to put this out there. Last bullet point. Disability may be the only identity group left where it continues to be okay, openly and blatantly to say that. I ask you, is there another identity group for which we can outright say, just fill in the blank, I'm not going to say it, for the reason of X, fill in ethnicity, race, the child looks different, the child's weight, the child's lunchbox and what's in it, the child's accent. Would it be acceptable to say, you're not going to fit in, you'll fit in with people just like you? It would not fly for any other group. But for disability, it is commonly acceptable to say it is better for them to be with others just like them. Next slide, Stephanie. And then the last thing I want to touch on is this idea of inequities based on privilege. It's clear from all the research, including this one and a bunch of others over the last 2 decades, as I said earlier, inclusive education is driven by parent advocacy. All that is great. We help our kids, as we should, because we are parents. I get it. I'm a mom too, right? But we have to start realizing that, and I'm implicating myself, by the way. I have advocated for my own daughter. I said she was in inclusive education all her life, and it took a lot of advocacy. And I'm a professor of inclusive education, and it was hard. It was hard for me. It was hard for me. I was reduced to tears. So why am I saying this is because, well, if it's hard for someone that has that level of privilege, what chance does another mom, another dad, another caregiver who may not necessarily know, like why you don't have a child and then suddenly know special education laws? You don't, like, why would they be expected to know that? And why would they be expected to advocate for that? And not everyone has the time, the resources, the finances to hire advocates and attorneys in some cases. And when we rely on parent advocacy, the problem is it leads to disproportionate outcomes for our children. The children of those who know, who have access to information, we're able to counter the system to some extent. And even then, not necessarily, right? But those who don't have access. And when you look at the numbers of the disproportionate representation to this day of minority children, of children of color in self-contained classrooms, you can kind of see how this is all playing out, right? I'm not saying that's the only reason, but it's a contributing factor. And so individual advocacy leads to inequities in outcomes for children. And ultimately, the biggest problem is it leaves the system unchanged. Each time I fish one child out of the water, the bigger problem of, I guess, who's throwing the kids in the water remains unchanged. Next slide. So what can parents do together? And I'll throw it back to Stephanie and the folks of SPAN. But I think that we need to move more and more to a collective advocacy model, from an individual advocacy to a collective activism, if you will. And by the way, for those parents here in the group, activism is our historical roots. This is the story of family activism. This is how special education laws were originally passed in 1975. Public Law 94-142 was because of the collective, not individual, the collective banding together. We have a rich history of family advocacy going back to the mid-60s that led to the rights of children even to have an education, of children with disabilities to have a right to a public education in the first place. So I say, I propose that we go back to our original roots, which is collective advocacy for broader systemic change instead of one by one advocacy. So I'm going to give the floor back to Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Priya. That was so much amazing information. The chat box has been blowing up, so we're going to get to questions in a moment. And so we wanted to talk about this next step, about what brings us here tonight and the next part of the conversation, which is what can your CPAG do? You know, CPAGs, when we talk about that collective advocacy part. And so one of the things that we talked about on our team was the concept and the idea of a car, of driving. So really thinking about, driving change, driving what is going to motivate you and your group in your collective advocacy to try to make a difference within the school district. And so it's about driving to success. And I came up with this acronym. I love an acronym. So you can really use this as a tool to engage your district and your parents, your community members in creating and implementing a plan for change. It's incorporating this planning process into your efforts to develop clear mission, to build consensus, and to move your group's ideas into action. So we start first by looking at, where do we start with this? It's by looking at the data. Data is information, and that information can be used to generate conversations, to create your action plan, and to impact change. Data can come in many different forms, from parent input. And I never want to walk away from that as a parent group and as a CPAG. You always want to continue to always be getting your parent input, hear from the parents of what is going on. So getting that parent input, being at the meetings, having a seat at the table at these meetings in your district, looking at the reports that are out there. There is so much information and data and numbers that are out there that you can get from within your own school district to take a look at. And then also looking at the state level. The Department of Education has an entire website of all data and reports that you could take a look at, from special education profiles within your own school district to your school performance reports. These are things this is where you want to start taking a look at that information to be having those conversations. And also getting information at committee meetings or Board of Education meetings. This provides a snapshot of what is going on, how decisions are made, and how actions impact your school culture and climate. As a parent group, you want to attend those meetings, read the information, and ask the questions, and look at what are the barriers that are going on, and is there sufficient data here to drive the change? This is part of the action plan, part of what you're going to be doing. The next is rallying your supporters. We talk about the parent group, but you want to be able to have your web of supports, right? So it's really, as the saying goes, more hands make light work. So you want to align with those who share the same ideas and values and are committed to making change. Who can get on board with these ideas? Why do they care about this? Can they look beyond their individual concerns and see the big picture of how this issue has a systemic impact? The next step to this is to implement the plan. And I want to say, we will be providing in the resources kind of like charts and sheets and things to help you with this as a CPAG. The next is implement the plan. What actions will occur and by whom? When will this take place and for how long? And what resources are needed to carry out these changes? When we talk about implementing the plan, and I'm sure as parents in IEP meetings, we talk about SMART goals, but here it's called SMARTY goals. So it's actually taking it a step further and creating goals that are inclusive and equitable. By incorporating equity and inclusion into your SMART goals, you can make sure that your group's commitment to equity and inclusion for all is anchored by some actionable steps. And then the next in there is voices and values. So you create an action plan. The next step in that action plan is, how are things going? To take a look at how your action plan is going. Are we making progress? Are we engaging all stakeholders in the process? And how are we communicating progress and ensuring that all voices are heard and represented? So making sure that that is part of the process. And then the last step here is ensuring the sustainability. So reviewing and reflecting on the process, celebrating your wins, and ensuring a plan is sustainable by embedding best practices into the policy and the programs that highlight the collective efforts. So that's kind of the model here of how to drive for success. And again, we have these in the resources. But the last thing I wanted to say on this too is, as you are thinking about as you begin to drive here, and again, I love this metaphor too, because we think about the idea of driving and looking in the through the windshield, how big it is, and knowing that, looking behind you, the rear view mirror, but looking ahead, there's so many opportunities. There's so many ways that you as a collective CPAG can make an impact and make a difference. But remember a few things here. Change takes time. especially, I mean, the things that Priya talked about this evening is such a huge shift. So be patient. Be patient and ride the course, because change can happen and change will happen. But to go from where we are right now, which is what, last 50th, it's such a big cultural shift that needs to happen. But stay empowered and stay engaged. And you may have to shift gears, and that's fine. But you want to make sure that you stay the course. Beth, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add to this slide. I don't know if Beth is
Oh,
here.
well, I like to say that it's a two-way street. So, as much as we are all talking about it with our children who, have IEPs, the conversation is much, much larger, and it has to include the general education population. So, as you are making your connections as the CPAG leaders and, parent leaders, make your connections with as many people as you can across the district. It's not going to happen off on the side, right? That's not going to make it, that's not going to move the course and the shift the system. It needs to be where you're having your allies and your connections, and you're building your relationships with people across the district as much as possible. So I really want to emphasize that, because we all know what needs to happen, but it's getting that information to everybody else and having the conversations and allowing for it to unfold so that they understand just what we have been talking about, that the benefit is for everyone.
Mhm. Absolutely. Thank you for that. And so what we're going to do is we have the link to the evaluation. So in these last few minutes this evening, we want to open the floor to questions. I know Anna has her hand up, so we're going to get to Anna with her question. And as we're doing that, if someone, Beth or Ellie or Ellen, someone can drop the link to the evaluation. So when you complete the evaluation, as if you know our workshops, you complete the evaluation and then you get a thank you. And when you see the thank you, it's a link to our resource folder. But stay tuned, because we continually add resources to that folder. So hold that link, save it as a favorite, because we'll keep adding to it. So I'm going to go first to Anna, who has her hand up. Hi, Anna. How are you? Are you there, Anna?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, thank you. And so first of all, thank you to SPAN for facilitating this really meaningful webinar, and to Priya for all the amazing information. So for a little context, I guess I've been really pushing for inclusion for my child. The presentation was going on, and it was just a lot of thoughts, like, because this is a singular effort, as she was saying, like we really need to move into a collective advocacy. That really struck me as because I mean, she's right, like these are embedded systems, and to change that, it requires so much more than just one parent speaking out or speaking up. And I guess because the way our system is set up in our district is essentially, the child has to earn their place in the general education setting. And, so my son has started in an ABA classroom, pre-K or preschool, when he was 3 years old. And when I learned that he was not accessing general education curriculum, I didn't know that at first, because the child study team doesn't tell you that. They tell you all the benefits of the self-contained classroom and how, your child's needs will be best served in that self-contained setting. And so that's, and I genuinely believe that special educators are well-meaning, and they are not segregating our children out of this like malicious malice, right? They really do feel like our kids need that setting, I guess. But the more and more, I present the research, the law, just the fact that, like, why is our placement discussion not starting in the general education classroom? Why is it starting in this, like, he can be there partially for part of the day, and he can, it's more like mainstreaming and integration rather than inclusion. And little by, it's like, let's take baby steps, let's include him little by little and see how he does. And
I love the phrase they say, trial. We'll trial it.
yeah, and that's how it's been the last few years. It's, so he started in that ABA setting. And as soon as I found out, like, that's basically what I was pushing for, inclusion, without really realizing, well, what does that really mean? And inclusion is not just a seat at the table, a chair, right, in the classroom, a table in the classroom. It's really the supports and services through the supplementary aids and supports as per the law. But so I'm sorry, I'm like being very long-winded here, but I guess without having to, like, I guess like I'm at such a loss for what to do now. Like, yes, I want to continue to push for systemic change, but every school day, every precious school day is passing, and my child is now in third grade. Still, yes, he does have time with his general education peers, but he still is pulled out into a self-contained classroom, and his classification is still under special education because of the percentage of the day is not greater than 80%. So, which these arbitrary percentages make no sense to me as well. But it's like, what can we do in the interim? Like, what can we do to support our children? Because, I go into the IEP meeting with the list of supplementary aids and services that can be utilized in the general education setting. But really, that would require, I understand that would require extra work from both the general education teacher and the special education teacher, because that would require a lot of collaboration. It would require training for the paraprofessional who's in there with my child. And, but with all of that, the response from the child study team is continuously, let's see how he does with X, Y, and Z support. Because right now, with X, Y, and Z support, he's not showing that he's ready. And he's not showing that he's ready because the environment is not set up for success.
Right.
So how do we encourage our district to adjust the environment rather than trying to put the onus on the child?
Right. Thank you for that. Priya, did you want to?
I'm gonna let you take the first stab at that. I mean, yeah, I mean, you said so many amazing things, Anna, that are just right on. I just want to acknowledge that you said that there are many teachers that are genuinely, like, well-intentioned, and I cannot emphasize that enough as a teacher educator. I mean, shout out to all my students. They are amazing, fantastic, beautiful people, and who are genuinely of the belief that that a separate place is better. But the other thing you said later is that you acknowledge that it's a bit of extra work. Now, yeah, it's a bit more work, of course, but in the long run, it's sort of front-loaded work, but it's going to benefit lots of people to set up systemically, right? The supports that many students can acknowledge, can benefit from. But while it's important to acknowledge that people are well-intentioned, it is also important to realize that it is easier to segregate students based on students' abilities. So those are both truths. It is easy. Of course, I'm an educator, and it's easier for me to work with groups that are all, similar, but that's not in their best interest.
Mhm.
Mixed ability groups are, you have to think creatively. You do have to sort of think outside the box a bit. And it is better for students, all
Mhm.
students.
Mhm. Thank you for that. I see that Jen had her hand up next. So we'll get to Jen and then to Maurice and then to Allie. And then I know there were some questions, but I have to be mindful of everyone's time. So we'll go through. So Jen, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I have two quick questions. My first question is for Dr. Lalvani. In the research that you've done, I'm interested to know if you've taken a look at how the uptick in school violence over the past like 20, 30 years has also affected the rate of kids being segregated, because kids as young as like kindergarten, first grade are being told that they're a safety risk. And I don't want to divulge too much personal information, but I've been there for things as simple as, eloping, which is definitely a safety risk, but there's so much legal CYA happening. And I've talked to other parents about this too, where it's like you're never gonna get out of this quagmire of like legal CYA. And the schools can kind of like frame things however they want. And it's not really fair to the kids. So there's that aspect. I'm interested if your research has touched on that. And my second question is for SPAN. I've been in contact with you guys, and I've done some of the webinars about starting a CPAG, and it's kind of been like a long slog for us because our district is resistant to starting a parent-led CPAG, and we're still working on it. It's still coming along, but I kind of wonder if for this collective advocacy, if you've ever thought about starting like a state level CPAG for like CPAG orphans out there who really want to be advocates for change, because I know grassroots districts, like that's definitely important. We have to do that, but it could also be on the state level. Like, there's a Department of Education on the state level as well that we could affect change there. So those are my two questions.
I can take the second part, and then Priya could take the first part. The second part is I would suggest the SEAC, the State Special Education Advisory Council, that meets once a month. And again, I'll put that in the resource list tomorrow. But the link to it, they have meetings. I don't believe they have one for December. I might be wrong. I'm not sure if they're having one in December, but it's usually like the third Thursday of every month in the morning, and it's virtual. At 9:30 in the morning, and you can log in, and there's an opportunity in that meeting for public comments. And I think that that's a good opportunity there to voice concerns, because it's at the state level. It's the State Special Education Advisory Committee, and they talk about a lot of different issues and things that are going on. And I think that that's a very good forum to have it. And it's something that we at SPAN can also help with trying to work with as well. Our team can help with it because Jen, you and I have spoken. So we'll continue to talk, and I can help you with some other things as well. So, but that's where I would start with that. And then I'll defer to Priya for the other question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, who's asking the question? I meant to use your name, but
Me, Jen Hansen.
Okay, Jen, hi. So I was just jotting a few points down. So I haven't done my research does not touch on that. However, I will give you some thoughts based on my work generally. And you do hear this a lot about safety, and it's safer, and they will elope. So my first question is, how is it safer in a segregated setting, and who is it safer for? So we have to ask ourselves, so whatever it is that's being done in a self-contained segregated setting that is somehow making it safer, like I'd like to know what that is, and how we can transport that. I mean, those services have to be portable, right? Can we provide those elsewhere? How is a child who is deemed unsafe to him or herself or others in a general education classroom not going to be that same person in a self-contained classroom? So that's my first question. What are they doing there that makes it safe? Then there's the elopement. They will elope from the general education classroom. They will not elope from the self-contained classroom. That always puzzles me. Is it locked? I don't know. The other thing I want to say is, okay, let's say that due to safety reasons, a child must be removed. If that is the case, our law does say that there should be a plan to bring the child back. That I don't see. If you removed a child based on a safety concern, there must be a plan in place. Like, how are we going to bring this child back? That second part needs to be discussed. And the other thing I want to say is there is a ton of research on the self-contained schools, segregated schools designated for those with emotional disturbances, behavior disorders, whatever, those categories are, perhaps among the most subjective categories of all. There's a lot of research on the outcomes of that. Those spaces are not havens of a wonderful safety and great conduct. There's a lot been written on school to prison pipeline and how the removal of a child, by the way, very much intersecting with that child's race and ethnicity as well here. There's a lot going on. The removal of that child because of safety is sometimes placed in a school for conduct disorders as a school to prison pipeline kind of thing. I mean, what is going on in that school is very interesting as well. And I don't think is the solution. Like clustering a group of children who are exhibiting problematic behaviors in one room. I mean, you don't need a PhD to know that that's a bad idea. And yet we rely on that. We say we'll take all the kids that are exhibiting challenging behaviors and we'll put them in a room called behavior challenge room. And somehow that's a good idea.
Mhm. Yeah.
Thank you. I agree. And what you said about it being a subjective category, I couldn't agree more. And yeah, I've read up a lot about the school to prison pipeline. There is so much research coming out now that there's just that added nuance of it's so hard to advocate for inclusion because nobody is, once they whip out the school safety argument, it's who's coming up against that. You've got no way out of that, and it feels like you're just locked in. But anyway, thank you for your perspective.
The only thing I can offer you is that at least there should be a plan for return in place.
Yes, thank you for that. That's a good point.
Thank you. And so we're just in the interest of time. I'm sorry, we're just going to get to, I know Maurice and Ali, and then maybe what we'll do is I'll download the chat, and Priya, maybe like you and I can take a look at the chat, and and if there's some things you can respond to, like in a follow-up email or something. Maurice.
Yes, thank you so much, so much, so much. Thank you so much for this presentation, Dr. Lalvani and SPAN. This information is so necessary, and also it's just so eye-opening to see that, New Jersey is dead last, being that we are one of the richest states in the country. And that actually leads me to one of kind of two questions that are, it's kind of like a two-part question, but what states are doing well, and maybe like what particular districts are doing well that maybe we can look to get ideas from on how we can improve inclusion or advocate for better inclusion in our own districts. And then also, my daughter is in the Plainfield School District, and I think one of the things that we are so challenged with is parent participation and just kind of getting the word out. And if we are going to partner with parents of students who are in general ed, students who don't have IEPs, and to help educate them also, that saying that inclusion is not just great for students with disabilities, but really it improves the lives and experiences of everyone. How do we kind of get the word out and get more parent participation and partnership in this entire movement?
So yeah, a lot of questions there. I don't know off the top of my head, but the top three. But I can actually, as Stephanie said, I can respond with the top three states. I think that New Hampshire is among there. I mean, Vermont's doing better than us. It's not in the top three, but it's doing well. And there's another couple of like Midwestern states.
I think Washington, right? Washington.
I don't know if Washington is also among the top three, but some of them, a couple of them are surprise ones. I'd like to say, I don't know if it's Montana or something that one would not think, but I can certainly send that your way. There's actually a really cool interactive chart that I can send a link to you, Stephanie. That's part of the US
Yeah, that'd be great.
the data that you can just hover on the. It's really cool. You will love that. I keep that handy for my students. It's interactive. You just hover your cursor on the different states and the number pops up, right? So our number 45, 71, like you can just hover and you can see. It's a really cool little tool. So I will certainly send that your way. Yeah, you had a lot of questions there.
Yeah, and also in the resources, I did include the link to the report from the US Department of Education where the statistics came from, where we see that New Jersey ranked 50th. And it's, so that report, it's a big report, but the data is in there. So you can see that as well.
And one more thing that I failed to mention, but I don't know if everyone's aware, to the point about educating other students about disability, which not everyone thinks is part of inclusive education, but I certainly do. I think it's part of true inclusivity that you not only just target the student with a disability, but everybody. To that point, is everyone aware that in 2020, Governor Murphy signed into law that all schools starting in, I think, fifth or sixth grade, I'm not sure, must actually teach about disability within their curriculum in the natural places. So that's been law now, yet most people don't know that it is, and it's not really necessarily being implemented. So you can use that as a way to start a conversation with your schools. How are we opening the conversation about disability and human differences and variation with our students? Because now it's not just a nice thing to do. I mean, at least starting in fifth grade, we are required to do it. So we can ask our districts about that.
Thank you. And we'll get to Allie with the last question for the evening. Hi, Allie. Are you there?
Hi, echoing the gratitude for the presentation tonight. And I could talk about this all night, but I'm gonna try to be as concise as possible. I just wanted to share for the people that we're saying in the chat, what do we do next? Or thanks for making me not feel delusional and all of these kinds of things. Dr. Lalvani and her work first came into my orbit like 3 years ago, almost exactly 3 years ago through one of these webinars. And I just wanted to share that it really lit my fire. And since then, I started my SEPAG and we're really going strong. We're doing really good work here in Collingswood. We have about 20 regular attendees that come to our meetings. Right now, we're doing Inclusive Schools Week, and I'm happy to share the link to the resource that we put together for our district so you can see what work we're doing here. My son is now in fifth grade, so I decided at the end of second grade that I didn't want to be pissed off for the next 10 years of school. And I really decided to try to do something rather than just being angry. And I do think that change is possible. It's very incremental and it's very slow, but this is our third year doing Inclusive Schools Week. And we also do Neurodiversity Week here in Collingswood. And we're really starting to see buy-in from admin and also the teachers and staff. We're starting to see that students are like looking forward to it as part of their like school culture. And I am really proud that my son is experiencing a greater sense of belonging in his education and his school and his background because of this. So I just wanted to like share that as a way to say like it does take years, but please start somewhere. You can reach out to me. Really, I did it with the fire under my ass from Dr. Lalvani and the CPAG manual, which I consider the Bible. And
Yeah.
you can too. So that's my 2-minute spiel. And keep advocating. It really does matter. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I wanted to say, Collingswood actually came up today in our team. We have our weekly team meeting with my start team, and Collingswood came up because we're probably going to be reaching out to you. Ellie on my team will probably be reaching out to you. We're going to be starting to do a series where we're interviewing some SEPAGs, and we're going to be doing a whole series on the collective voice, and they're going to be really nice videos that Ellie will be working on. So stay tuned, Ellie. Ellie will be hearing from Ellie. A little confusing. To do an interview. So there are some CPAGs that we will be reaching out to, and if any CPAG leaders are interested in being a part of this, to email me. But I also wanted to say you gave me an idea of some work that I think our team could really be working on. And we have our CPAG support clinics, and I want to just kind of do a real pitch for a moment. Keep in contact with me if you are not sure if you have a CPAG in your district, if you're looking to reboot your group, if you're looking to increase parent participation, whatever it is that you're looking for your parent group. Our team is here. We've got Beth and Ellen and Ellie and Mackenzie and Brenda. We cover the state. We're in all the counties. So doing the work and helping you. We want to help because that's what we do to help with getting the groups up and running and sustain. The sustainability is what's so important too, and to keep the momentum going and to find something like this. So if you as a CPAG leader are identifying that inclusion is something we need to work on within our district, improving the school culture and climate around inclusive education, contact us. We can help with giving you some ideas, some strategies, some resources, some ways that you can connect with your school district. Because again, at the heart of it, it's also about building those collaborative relationships too, right? So how to navigate those waters, how to have those conversations with your school district. And I think Inclusive School Week is a great moment to have the conversations, to start talking about, to look ahead toward next year, right? So there's many opportunities, and you gave me some ideas of things that our team could be working on into the new year to be more specific to some of these topics, like especially with inclusive education. I just wanted to say that. So thank you, Allie, for being here tonight. And
Yes, thank you.
yes.
Sorry, I was just going to say, sorry about Allie. I brought you up today because I think you're a really good model district, what you all are doing. And here in Hatfield, in my district, we're struggling to get people involved. And so I just wanted to applaud your work as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm really, really relentless.
Well, you got to be. I mean, and that's the whole thing too, I kind of went through that acronym before, but it's such, we are last in the country. Like this is, so like you said, increments. It's about acknowledging and celebrating small things that you can do. Even if you can get your district to agree to do a school, a culture and climate, I just getting a committee going, even like at your board of ed, can they create a committee, a culture and climate committee that where parents can come and have it be part of a committee, even just starting there, and so there's little small things that you can do, celebrate those small wins, but know that those are steps in the right direction, because this is such a huge shift that needs to happen in terms of just changing a whole mindset and shifting the paradigm. So with that said, we're going to wrap things up. Like I really, we went a couple of minutes over, but this was so worth it. I mean, Priya, we could talk for like another 4 hours tonight easily, right? This was so wonderful. I thank you so much for your time. I thank everyone for joining us this evening. the resources are there. Priya, you'll give me some more resources. I'll send you some of the chats. And again, I apologize we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but we'll have the chat box. And I'll send you some of those questions. That would be great if you could get some of the answers. The link to the evaluation should be in the chat box. And I guess that is a wrap. So I'm going to stop sharing here. And I thank everyone for joining us this evening, and especially to Priya. Priya, thank you so much for coming back. You're
Thank you.
wonderful.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And what a great group this was. You all are an awesome group. I really just want to shout out to Dr. Osija. Again, I see her box now. Eileen, are you there? So I just want to shout out that she's been we use the word warrior. She's the warrior with me.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
thank you.
Oh,
And
there.
thank
Hi.
you. Thank you for inviting. Oh, there she is.
Hi.
There she is.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your work and all that you do. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And thank you to my team for a great job. Have a great night, everybody. Take care.